Welcome back, Alex Wiseman here. We're still talking about preschool and three cultures revisited. We just spent a little bit of time walking through some of the theoretical framework that we have set up in classes prior to this week. And we were starting to ask some questions about preschool and three cultures revisited specifically that might help us use some of that that conceptual or theoretical framework to get at the ways that globalization and contextualization is represented in Preschool and Three Cultures Revisited. Now, the next thing that we were doing is we were looking at some of the authors, at all of the authors. We've got Joe Tobin, we've got Ye Sui, and we've got Mayumi Karasawa. And one of the things that we can note about all three of them, although it doesn't say this on Joe Tobin's actual title here, they're all educational psychologists. Now that is important because an educational psychologist will think of things in a slightly different way than an educational sociologist or an economist of education or someone else. So we might think for a minute about what are some of the unique perspectives that an educational psychologist would bring to this sort of a study that someone from a different background wouldn't necessarily bring. Well, one of the things, and just this is a large one, so we can take it or leave it for what it's worth, is that psychologists are often interested in individual experiences. That is because of the importance of psychology to the way that people think, behave, act, interact, etc. Now that is a really unique perspective and a very important one. But it is somehow different from a social or a cultural perspective, more broadly speaking, that looks at groups or the ways that people act or think or move in relation to one another on the larger scale than it does the individual level stuff. And that is going to be an important distinction for us, as you'll see when we start talking about the purpose that Tobin, Sui, and Karasawa say that they have for their research study. Now, a little bit of the historical context for this. In the 1980s, 1984 in particular, they conducted a previous study called Preschool in Three Cultures. It was published as a book in 1989. I don't happen to have my copy with me. I think it's at the office on campus. But the 1980 study goal was, quite simply, to explore connections between early childhood education and the larger society in each country. I'll get my pen ready to go. So explore connections between early childhood education and larger society. Now, what's interesting to me is that educational psychologists would tackle this. Right? What is it about this question that they found particularly interesting or appealing? And in the 2000s, I think it was 2002, yes it was because it says right there, their goal was the same, but they also wanted to, and this is the quotes here, find explanation for why a day at each preschool in 2002 has come to look so different from a day there in 1984. So yes, they want to explore connections between early childhood education and the larger society in each country. But they also want to know why what each preschool did in 1984 looks so different from what it's doing in 2002. Now they have another question as well, which they don't say is one of their main research questions, but we'll get to it in a second. In fact, here it is. They say on page 4, have Chinese, Japanese, and American early childhood education ideas and practices grown more alike since we did our original study in the mid-1980s? So if we have China, Japan, and the U.S., and we're looking at preschools in each of those countries, a preschool in each of those countries. The first question that they asked was, if we have early childhood education and then we have society here, what accounts for that difference, right? What are the connections between early childhood education and society in China, in Japan, and in the U.S.? Right? And then they also did some look at whether or not China, Japan, and the U.S. shared any characteristics or not originally. Now, what they're doing differently now, let me just erase that. Now they're saying, okay, let's say that we had, let me do a different one. Early childhood education plus society. What are the connections there? Right? China, Japan, U.S. So this was 1984. Now, in 2002, there has been some change. They're still looking at early childhood education and society and what that looks like in each of these countries. But they're saying that in 2002, there's been some sort of change. These lines would represent some sort of change. And the question is, and keep this figure in mind as I erase the ink again, the question would be, let's say they started off China, Japan, U.S., and they ended up China, Japan, U.S. So are they suggesting that there has been some sort of narrowing, right, of what's going on? That the differences between each of these societies and the way that they handled early childhood education was greater in the mid 1980s and is less in 2002. This has grown more alike. Right? Or are they suggesting that actually the opposite has occurred? Let me draw another option here. That instead it's been a change like this, that there was a smaller difference, but now instead of becoming more alike, they become more different. And that's what they're going to surprise us with as we read the book. Well, I want to suggest that there is another option that we might want to consider. That yes, maybe we have China, Japan, and the U.S., and they each start wherever they start. And then here we have China, Japan, and the U.S. I'm not saying they're more alike or less alike, but what would be interesting is on this journey, the changes that occur from 1984 to 2002, was there any sort of way that each of these countries mimicked each other or shared expectations? The exact path, as you can hopefully see from the way that I've drawn these, might vary from country and society to country and society. Right? These aren't supposed to be the same in terms of trajectory. What might instead be happening is that there's quite a bit of variation in one and much less variation in another, but that there are some shared movements that take place over time. Right? Some of them will cause this distance to be closer. Some of them will cause this distance to be greater. That, to me, is the interesting question. Now, I don't think that that is exactly the question that the authors, that Tobin and Sway and Kurosawa are asking. Although they kind of get at it, but I'm not sure they understand exactly what they're getting at. I think instead they're looking at the products. Where do we start and where do we end? And not always considering this in between stuff. Now, they do paint a slightly different picture, which we're going to look at here. This is a pretty lengthy quote. It starts at the bottom of page 3 and ends at the top of page 4. And I know that it looks kind of light on the screen now. That's because I'm going to walk us through it one sentence at a time. So if you need to look at this in the book, bottom of page 3, top of page 4, but you've got it all right here. So what they want to do, remember, is they're asking, have Chinese, Japanese, and American early childhood education ideas and practices grown more alike? Ideas and practices grown more alike since we did our original study in the mid-1980s. Let me just change my pointer color. Let's make it yellow. Sure. Now, we've got ideas. And the other, that's ideas and practices. So this is their question. Now, how do they answer that? Well, they say one potential source of change in each country's approach to early childhood education is the importing of ideas from abroad. So they start out right at the beginning. We're only on page 3 at this point, saying that a potential source of change, one reason why we think that this equation right here might be happening, is because of the trend of importing ideas from abroad. So they are going to suggest that the change from here to here is likely because of importing ideas from abroad. And they suggest that there are contrasting theoretical perspectives. Now, we're going to read through these and we're going to talk about them, but I'm going to start off by telling you that I have a bias. And my bias is that I think they're setting up false dichotomies. I think they're setting up false contrasts, and I'll explain why as we go through. I'm going to sneeze. I'm sorry, I have a cold. All right, I managed to hit the pause button right before I sneezed. Trust me, be glad that you're not in the same room with me. I have a fierce cold, and this is a much safer way to talk to you right now. Okay, I was just saying that I have a bias, and my bias is that I think they're setting up a false dichotomy or a false contrast between what they're calling world system theory and other stuff. So let's look at how they set it up first, and then we can talk about some critiques of that. They say world system theories of educational borrowing and lending see the world as an increasingly globalized system and chart a growing convergence, that's going to be a key word they're using, over time in a nation's educational ideas and practices. And then they cite Meyer and Ramirez 2000 and Ramirez 2003, which, by the way, I want to point out when you look in the bibliography at the end of this book. Meyer and Ramirez from 2000 is in there. That's a chapter they wrote in a book that Jürgen Schriever published called Discourse Formation in Comparative Education. Ramirez 2003 is never cited in here. There's an oversight. Maybe we should contact Chicago University Press and tell them they made a mistake, but I think I can tell you which one it is. Anyway, but they cite Meyer Ramirez. Remember, we talked about John W. Meyer. We talked about Cheeky Ramirez just earlier in the last screencast. So, they're saying that the world system theory approach is, first of all, promoted by Meyer and Ramirez and others like them, and that it charts a growing convergence in educational ideas and practices. This word right here is going to be important because we want to contrast it with another word called isomorphism. Keep that thought. Then they go on to say other theorists, in contrast, see the global flow of educational ideas as rising and ebbing over time with shifting political contexts, as policymakers in some eras use the foreign cachet of educational ideas from abroad to justify domestic policy reforms. Well, first of all, I'm not really sure why they're saying that this is in contrast to the idea that they set up previously. Maybe you see it more clearly. I'd love to hear that in the discussion board comments. Then they say, at other times, policymakers strip imported ideas of their aura of foreignness to make them more domestically palatable. This would be the development of externalities and sort of aligning what happens within a particular organization, context, or system with what's happening outside of it. And that's an idea directly from Jürgen Schriever. And then they say at still other times, policymakers reject and expel foreign ideas as dangerous and unwelcome. And then they go on to quote Schriever 2000 and 2004, Steiner-Kamsky 2000 and 2004. These are from well-known books that each of them have edited. Now, this is interesting to me. I find it fascinating. Because what's fascinating about it is that there are some assumptions made about what Tobin and his friends are calling world system theories, and what other theorists suggest. I'm just going to say, and have a lot of research and history in the field to back this up. They're setting up a false dichotomy. They're